I thought very clearly over the last few days what I'd actually say to you. I'm not used to doing this sort of work because I spend my life with very hard outcomes and having to achieve them with young people. And I haven't a clue what impact I'm going to say to you as any connection whatsoever with these young people in Australia. And that worries me a little bit. So I'm giving it to your conscience to decide. So to help you in this, I'd like you to think of two things while I'm talking. You all have different roles. I'm a head teacher, quite proud of that. And that's been my laboratory over many years. Very important part of what I do. So first of all, would you employ me? Many of you are in a position where you could employ me. So while you're going along, just think whether you'd stick me in front of your children and think they were safe. And they might actually, as I would say to children, to parents when they would come to Ravenswood School, the most important thing is that we send your children home safely, having arrived at the school. And the second most important thing is they might have learned something on the way. But this is an important part of it. And the second thing is you have different roles. If you were in the position of Tony Blair, or the Minister of Education at that time, who was David Blunkett, would you have actually taken the risk? And if you did, how would you have supported it? If you were like Kevin and running a district at that time or local authority, how would you interface with us group? What would you do? And you've all got different positions. So if that's helpful, maybe you get something constructive out of the episode, even if just to say, well, actual fact, that's all very well, but we'll forget all about that because the context is such and the story is just not worth attending to. So I'm expecting a nil result, so don't feel offended. I will also say, as we know about teachers, and one of our big problems with teachers we know is they teach as they were taught. They've spent years learning the micro-political environment in which those lessons would take place. I went to a very strict school. It was a slightly military school, and in fact, speaking in lessons was considered something you got caned for. This didn't change until I reached 16. Therefore, I don't expect any chatter, feedback from any of you whatsoever. You also learn after a period of time, if I present in this way, that all of you, because you're about my age or slightly younger, not to offend some of these youngsters who are used to talking, you shouldn't be paying with your phones because I can't cope with that at all. Anyone who does anything else at the time, of course you can work with your phones. But what I'm saying is interesting environment about just kicking off where we start from. And that's a huge problem because in education, the mass of our service is provided by teachers who've been 5 or 10 years in their role, who've reached the end of their motivation in that basis, and they're the ones who we need to change. Not the outstanding people who are full of new ideas or on the internet looking at all this and all the rest of it, but actually the core of the business is people who get up day to day and go into schools and do the work. They're the people, and they teach more, by the way, because the people who are very able get time off. They actually have to spend less time with the children than the people who do the delivery of the work. So just if you have a think about. Okay. So these are the roles I've held. At the same time as being a head teacher of an outstanding school, I've also always turned around a failed school at the same time. I thought I ought to put my money where my mouth is. There's a reason for that as well, is that my task is to innovate. And I've also, over the years, heard the Education Service continually talking about top-down, bottom-up. It's rubbish. Innovation comes from the people who actually do it. No one defines a mobile phone set and decides that you don't use a mobile phone set. This is like coaching a rugby team, never attending any of the matches and then having a chat afterwards. The system is full of people who do innovation, who have no responsibility for the outcomes and claim they're involved in innovation. They're not. They're involved of supervising some element of education. Sorry, I'm a hard-nosed head. You're not going to get anything nice. From this, I'm just going to tell you the way it is, as I see it. As I said, you can decide. Some of you already decided you're not going to employ me ever again anyway. But I've been, in 2000, as Tony very nicely said, I was invited in 2000. But I have been a senior county education officer. So I was responsible, and that was interesting. It's when they introduced first bits of school management, when we got grant-tained movement. Schools were given their budget. When I was first a head teacher, before then, I was given £100 for the post and the telephones. And that was it. And I didn't give my staff were appointed by the local authority and everything. It was a very controlled system. But I was brought in to define the information systems that schools run on. And I learnt a lot from large system development of that nature. I work for Essex, which is the largest county candidate. Matt's here. We've chatted about this. But the system I created and the support system became part of Capita, which is now one of the 100 companies. But in doing that, I learnt very carefully about innovation was about, because my target was the head teacher in a school who I knew didn't even know what was in his bank account or her bank account, predominantly men, I have to say, because there wasn't many lady head teachers at that time. And therefore, we were going to give them a budget when they couldn't even run their own. And my view was, how will we engage those people who were disinterested, disaffected, and now were given huge responsibility for something they never really wanted at all? They hadn't gone into headship, the majority of them, to run a budget. They'd gone into headship to run a school. And the local authority ran the budget for them, and all of a sudden they were going to get this huge thing that they didn't really want at all. And for some of them, it was a complete anathema. They didn't want to get involved in this. And how would we use them? And when we designed the system, I was insistent, though the treasurer only wanted to know whether the money was going to get spent accurately and not get ripped off. But we put student data on the system. We had student data in the system because we wanted to force people to make a connection. Surely this money must produce something for students, so we'll stick student data on the system. And the one way we engaged the heads was when the heads turned up, they found all their data for their pupils on the system. So we used to train them through the data rather than the other way. But what I'm saying to you is about designing of innovation. Why do people get motivated? Why do people get involved? Who's your target audience? When you're sitting here, you're thinking about it. Who is this person in your mind's eye now that you're trying to change? It's not the people in this room. You've turned up because you're committed to it. It's all the people who aren't here. What are you doing about them? And they're the people who are delivering your service, because you're here, aren't you? They're all out there doing it. I know this is very obvious. Anyway, but the impact of the work has been quite significant. This is where we are. I mentioned about teaching schools. There are 600 teaching schools. We have an argument in the country about how big their networks could be, but roughly they cover half the schools in England. So half the schools in England now are linked into a teaching school alliance for some reason or other, and you can see that, and those people have said, I won't dwell on that anymore. Okay, so I'm going to just run through these different points with you and draw out parts of it as we go along. I gave you a set of notes. If you've looked at them, I spoke to my daughter beforehand about this, and she said, Dad, this is really important. People will want to tweet about, what goes on. So in the papers, there's some really good tweets. We spent a lot of time trying to devise tweets that wouldn't offend anyone. Now, as I don't know what I'm going to say before I said it, the chances I've generated some that I don't know anything about, but there are some on the papers. But this is quite an important bit, and I'll come back to it in a second, because I think it's an important part. I've been a little bit cynical, but it's an important part of what we do. Okay, so the story is this. I was in Canada because my friend from McGill University phoned me up and said, we've got a problem with the British sector out here, the English sector here in Canada, in Quebec, and we're getting beaten up by the results, and they're saying our schools are dreadful. And we don't know anything about data. I think there's something wrong with the data. Can you come and have a look at the data and do something about it? So I went over, met a few people, I had a chat with a few people, and from that, I've worked there ever since. A small board called the Western School Board. Unbeknown to me, there was a G7 meeting, and the G7 meeting, they had to declare everyone that happened to be, this is how real major innovation comes, it's all serendipity, which is one of the points I'm trying to make. Anyway, who was there? And I got called into number 10, and they said, why are you in Canada? And I said, because you don't know what you're doing, like you do. When they invite you in, I think you've got this completely wrong. And I said, well, why do you mean that? I said, well, your method of innovation is incorrect. And your problem is not the problem that I think it is. I think your problem is the one of knowledge management, and your problem is how you intervene. And the way you innovate at the moment, as I've already described, is always top down or bottom up. It's not through the people who do it, and you should change what you do. So fully not expecting anything to happen, I then 6 weeks later got a phone call to say, well, come into number 10, we'd like to talk to you about this. So I sat in a room, and this is interesting, and I put this to the head teachers here, and it's a burden I've carried ever since. And it's one of the problems of being arrogant, because I sat in the room and Michael Barber came in and sat down opposite me and he said, George, yes, because they'd tracked my work for quite a long time. He said, we do agree with you. And we think that the solution we've got currently doesn't work and we'd like to look at another way of doing it. And we think you've got the solution that might make it work. So I said, what do you want me to do? And he said, we just want you to lead. And I said, well, what does that mean? They said, we just want you to lead, but you will lead from inside the system. Because the point I'd made was at that time, all the outstanding heads, as soon as they became any good, got moved into the administration. And I said, if we're ever going to understand how we do this job properly, surely we've got to keep, I mean, in hospitals, we don't take our most outstanding consultants who do all the major operations. As soon as they get really good at it, whip them out and stick them in the administration. We actually work on their skills even more and build them into it. And we're not into that. We weren't at that stage. Everyone who was any good, as soon as they got to a certain point, went straight into administration. And my argument was, if we're going to learn to do this properly, let's build some head teachers who have the capacity to learn how to do it, more capacity than the capacity just to get by, because we were discussing that, but the day-to-day sometimes swamps you. So if we have people in there who have more capacity, maybe we'll learn how to do the job better as they try to work with other people, which is a fundamental bit. So that's what I've been doing. And it's been a tough world. Because from my point of view, there's been early days, there was a lot of support. But I've been a tall poppy. And I don't know where you have them here, but it's like going down a hill with a toboggan with about 8 people on the back of you, also going faster and pushing you in different directions, while other people run around and kick your head in at the same time and your arms are out by your side, but you just keep going. And you're expected to smile during all the time and not get upset. But it's tough to do this. So what I'm saying to you, if you're going to ask people, administrators, your head, think about what you're asking them to do. Because you all have political frameworks to work in. I had none. If I used the political frameworks available to me, the power I had, as soon as I used it, my position changed dramatically. So I could phone up Loyal donors and say, look, I've got a real problem here, which I did with a couple of schools that we needed to close. But the net result of that would be that everyone would then think, oh my God, George is not this head teacher working with us. Actually, George is MI6 working for the department. And if you see my brown briefcase, there was a period of time when my brown rucksack arrived in a school, everyone would run away. Okay, so that's the way of work. So that's the first thing. So building on that, I've done all the jobs. So I did every single job. So I started with consultant leader. So I thought the way to transfer knowledge was to become a consultant leader. So I did the job. I learned how to do it, I described it, I built the training program for it, and then I backfilled it. So as soon as I got the job sorted out, that took me a year of consultant leader. I appointed 6, including Dame Sue John and some of the really outstanding heads that are in the UK. And many of them have been in my team. I think I've coached nearly half the leading heads in the country at one stage or other. But they formed my team, and then I learned how to be a support consultant. So how do you operate with a group of things? And that's where we learned was the business about very, very quickly was when you were coaching, look out for that bit when the excuses become reasons. Interesting part. So a consultant would go into a school, work with a school, and we would discuss why the school wasn't doing too well. And this would be, it would be fine. And the school would use excuses. Well, why not? The buildings aren't very good. All the rest of it. And this is happening. And the consultant would say, well, that's not true. Come on, let's deal with this. There's other schools doing just as well. We can move this on. We can get this and that. And then all of a sudden, you'd have the briefing with them after 6 weeks, and they'd say, you know, they're right. The buildings aren't very good. And you go, right, off you go. Get someone else. Let's move someone else in now. This coaching is finished. And this became an important part of it because of coziness. That's one thing. And the other thing I found that my colleagues, they were really hard on QAing. Very, very quickly they said, well, we want a way of training for this. You're not going to put me in a school unless you train me properly. So we brought people in from outside to train us from industry as consultants, because these people have massive integrity. They said, I'm not going to wander into some ordinary school and help them if you've not trained me. You train me to be a head. It's not right, George, now that you don't push me out there without training me. And they wanted the QAing of their colleagues as well. Do you know we have the highest rates of QAing amongst the head teachers of anything they've done? The reason why, they said that if you want to be, so Ofsted at that stage had 4 categories. well, they had 24 categories, but I'm just thinking, Kevin, but with 24 categories. In the modern world, they have 4 categories. But we made a decision. You could become outstanding if your school wasn't outstanding at teaching and learning. So the group said, well, look, if we're in the core business about improving the quality of teaching, that's rubbish. So no school can become in our group. No head teacher can enter this room unless they're outstanding at teaching and learning. We don't want you. Go back. And what caused chaos was there were at least 3 knights and a dame of the British Empire trying to join our team. We turned down, saying, well, look, what's the use of you coming to join us? You might be a outstanding leader, but the truth of the matter is your children really getting a good service in the education. Results might be good, but it says here that basically the day-to-day 25 hours a week that they're getting isn't good enough. Go and change it. Quite dramatic. And a lot of those measures that we produced are very, very hard, because there's also an issue about people not wanting to be having failure by association, because this is high-stakes stuff. I mentioned the business about being first through the door, but for a period of time I was Director of Education for Pearson, the international conglomerate, for my sins, and by many of my colleagues sitting at me and not speaking to me for a period of time. It's when Michael Barber went over, he decided to take me over. But they used to show a story, and I think this is quite true. They used to show a video about the concert. I don't know if you've seen the video about the concert, because Steve Jobs always talks about being second through the door. And as I said, I've always been first through the door. But what Pearson said they would always want was the people who were second through the door, because it's big. But anyway, they use this video where people are sitting on the side of a hill and there's a concert and one guy gets up dancing. Have you seen the one? Yeah. And very, very clearly. And then when the second person gets up, everyone dances, yeah? And that bit is really, I don't think that image has stayed with me. So along with the toboggan and that image, I think it's a really important one to think about. I've said about the QAing, we had a lot of collaboration in the UK building. So we had an organisation called, it still exists now, Specialist Schools Organisation we're running, and we're getting more and more collaboratives. What the heads started realising, also started imposing as a group, was saying, actual fact, this turns into a club very quickly. Now here we are, and it's just actually nice, convenient that we meet and chat and all the rest of it. If we're going to keep ourselves as a world-class system, we need to do this. So the challenge is really the important part. The support came quite easy, but the challenge is the bit to each other. And I used to live in fear, I'm very serious about my exam results, from my colleague Dame Sue John, who would read my exam results as they came out. And if they went down, I knew she'd be on the phone saying to me, George, your results are crap this year, and what are you going to do about it? And it became so bad that one year my results dipped to the national average for reasons that are rational. I wrote to the Minister of State and offered my resignation, saying that I do not think I should be leading this organisation if I cannot demonstrate that I'm outstanding in the system. Secretary of State, interesting enough, didn't reply to the letter, which would prevent dealing with Ofsted, and someone else phoned me up and just said, stop being a tart, George, and get on with your job. It didn't say that exactly, but it was sort of, if you like. But I'm very serious about it, because we felt that we weren't in a position entitled to lead the system if we weren't successful. And this is not the system doing this judgment, this is us as a group. How have I got a right to stand in front of my peers and tell them what to do if I'm not successful? What's that all about? And also, if you're not going to change the system, then you need to be successful in the system to change it from within. You can change it from without quite comfortably if you're not successful. And our dear politicians quite often change it from without being successful in the system. If that's a fact. And we suffer from that. But inside the system, if you want to change it, quite dramatically, you need to be good. You need to be outstanding so people listen to you. We've learnt that the thing was very organic. I see my time running down. I think things need to be very organic. We need to let things grow as they go naturally, not actually make an effort to push them. And the key roles in this is the catalyst, you, the people. What do you do with the knowledge that Kevin's going to generate? Do you actually take the knowledge and block it? Do you filter it? Are you going to actually energize it? So you're going to take the knowledge that Kevin's giving and say to someone, look, this is a really good piece of information for you here. And not only that, here's some resource to go with it, and go and take it and use it. Or is it just going to die on your door? And it's the catalyst, and there's a very good piece of work coming out from the IE that really make the system work. You've all talked about a theory of action here. The only thing I want to say about from the theory of action point of view here that I think is different than anyone else, I use a lot of concepts. And let's explain how that works. I spend a lot of time walking in London. I spend a lot of time just thinking. Because my job, one of my major jobs, is to try to make sense for a temporary period, because it's only temporary, everything that's going on for my colleagues. Because my colleagues most of the time don't have time to articulate what they do. They don't actually time, they're doing it. So I spend a lot of time just listening to what they're saying, seeing what they do, how they react to things, and just make it sense. So this is how it works. So something's been on my mind at the moment, which is about how do we get to understand how these networks develop. And in my theory of action at the moment, I see quite clearly now 5 stages. They're not that secure. There's mistakes in the analysis, but basically it works like this. The first barrier to collaboration is context. Right, so you put up context and you say, I can't collaborate with you because it's not the same context. Now you can break that down in different ways, and we have quite good techniques. Most schools break it down, by the way, by employing someone who's been successful in the same context. Either the head comes in and do it, or a member of staff does it, and you as administrators would challenge another school and put them in touch with a school that's in the same context. But context is the issue. Next thing is where you are now, that is information. Once the context goes, information then appears all of a sudden, comes rushing across. So we get all this content. And that gets you so far. But the next issue is that you actually have to take a commitment to the learning of the other people in the network. And that raises a key issue. Because at that point at which you decide to take commitment, it means to say you have to take what I would call not a system leadership role, but a systemic leadership role. In other words, you need to take responsibility beyond yourself for someone else who you're not responsible for. So as a head, you've got to feel that you can take responsibility for the outcome. This is really key, because in school, I'm responsible for teaching my students. And the learning happens securely because I take responsibility. If you don't take responsibility, and most of the people who are involved in education policy take no responsibility whatsoever with the outcome of their work. They don't actually, when things go wrong, it's someone else's fault. So they put the policy together and they don't take a commitment to when it fails. When we started in London, I thought one of the real tests was at the end of the first year when our failed schools had worked together. Before the exam results arrived at my door, 5 of the heads who were supporting other schools phoned up. And the first thing Kevin did today when he saw me was to tell me about a week ago, when I saw him, how good his primary school that he leads on the team results were. Remember? Immediately. A commitment to the outcome. Failure hurt. Personal. Not some superficial relationship, but personal. It matters. And without that commitment, nothing happens. The next stage then, if you move to commitment, then you have to look at the nature of knowledge, because you can't ignore the content's nature. So you have to, and that brings in coaching and mentoring, because a lot of the things we need to transfer, which are difficult, have to be done through coaching and mentoring. And then after that, it turns into a really complex collaboration. And I don't know what that means. So that's as far as my thoughts got at the moment. But that's how we work with creating a theory of action. I need to just say these 2 things. Yes, you let me have 5? Good, and I'll get to no problem. Right, I'm going to ignore the first 2, but the politicians in this room and the senior decisions makers, do me a favour and don't do what's happened in the UK. Every year now, for the last 5 years, I meet the most outstanding head teachers who are in Challenge Partners, who've given their time to support all these other schools, all the rest of it. They don't get any money for it, and they collect round them failed schools, and they support them. And they live like gibbering wrecks. Because they come in September, and none of them have got a clue if they're running a secondary school what their results are going to be. because someone's changed the grade boundary overnight, or someone else has decided the rules are slightly different. And there they sit there and they go to themselves, well, here we are, we have a set of students coming in here, we have a set of actions, you've just drawn your plan, what thing we should select, and there's no connection whatsoever with this decision I made about how I should improve my school and what happened to the students. Now, you're in a position at the moment where it seems to be, talking to you here, that you're very clear, that you have a very clear set of measures, though they're narrow, of what pupils do, which will allow you to make a link to what happens in the school. But if at the top you fiddle around with it and make the mistake that that's not that connection, you kill it. And so what do we get? Our senior teachers, these outstanding head teachers in the UK now, are drawn in two ways. In one way, in their guts and their souls, they want to give their students the best education they possibly can, and they know what happens day to day in the classroom between their students and their teachers is the most important thing that really matters to those children's learning. And they know that's wider than being literate and numerate. It's about building resilience. It's about working in a team. It's all about these other things that are important. But they also know if they don't game the results properly, they fail. And if they spend their time, the whole time doing that, if by mistake they enter the wrong exam paper, they're absolutely wiped out because their measure is based around, in a secondary school, just think it, in the UK, I ran a secondary school of 1,500 pupils. My results depended on 20 boys. My whole school depended on 20 boys in year 11. If those 20 boys in year 11 got English and maths, my school results went up 5%, and I was now nearly in the outstanding category, and if they all didn't get it, I was rubbish. Quite a scary setup, but you're going along the route of this measure, so please be careful with it. The final thing I want to say, for our work, this is the most important thing. The relationships, that trust, the belief that what you're doing is for the students, the empathy that you show, the fact that you build up a track record, the fact that you make decisions collaboratively, that creates the moral capital. And it's the moral capital that drives your moral purpose. What I've been amazed at since I've been here is the fact that you have got together to work together on a common solution. That whole trust that goes into this, people saying, I'm going to do this and doing it, are really important. I've said a lot today. Thank you very much for your tolerance. How many, by the way, just show of hands, I put you on the spot. How many of you would still employ me? Oh, no one. Thank you.
Thank you. George, let me just take a couple of minutes for any questions or comments, but let me ask you this. London Challenge, a couple of books have been written about this. This is not just a personal story, but I think it's been fantastic that you cast your presentation as a personal story. But if you had to step back and become, in effect, the author of the wider story of London Challenge, could you name the 2 or 3 things that you believe fundamentally made the difference and that you are still using those 2 or 3 strong messages in your work today? That's point 1. And point 2, I know you started by saying the only person who can validate my story is me. So therefore the question about what evidence base you were able to employ. Do us a postscript on how you are thinking now, as you did then, about the evidence base that you want to employ. So the top messages, why it was successful, what about the relationship to evidence?
Okay, I think the key issue is why it was successful. There was a massive alignment to begin with between all the groups, exactly what you're searching for here. There was an acceptance by everyone that the danger with this is that what you do is you keep on funding the existing system. And what Tony Blair's government said, look, this is not working, we need to do something different, rather than building on the existing structure. Because if you build on the existing structure, it actually throws up the whole issue of your compliance basis more, if you think about it. So you end up disciplining it to achieve what you want rather than being creative. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that, if I could say this, we work with the failed schools, and what we did was, it's interesting what heads do, and someone mentioned this earlier this morning. But when we reached the stage very quickly when we had enough staff, outstanding consultants, to work with our failed schools in the city. So we had spare cash. The department wanted to take it away from us because, of course, they didn't want us to have any free money. We could only sort out people who were failing. Fortunately, we convinced them to keep it. It's an interesting question. What did we do with that money? What was the next program that we introduced? Anyone would like to suggest? So there you are in a city, you've got your outstanding schools working with the failed schools and they're turning around, and you've got a leadership strategy. What did you do with the next bit of money? What would be your decision as a hard-nosed head? Someone's already talked about it. Okay, well, I won't put anyone on the spot, really, and I'll answer the question myself. Well, our decision was that every new head that came into London, no matter whether it was their first headship or second headship, would be coached, because we were convinced that most of the time we were tidying up mistakes made in their first 3 years. So we made all the other outstanding head teachers coach, and we built a community. And before we finished, we had a footprint in London, which started at 10% at about 360%. There's that bit, and the other bit was, we are part of London. There was a sense of identity, one. But second, London's education service now reflects London. It's dynamic, it's innovative, it's creative. It is the city. There's not a difference. Before, it was, if you like, negative. It wasn't within it's hard to explain, but it wasn't in that overall culture of what the city is now about. And so it moves. It is now an outstanding, I would say, knowledge-managed organisation. It has the best capacity to take new ideas, observe them, put them into practice, whether it's externally or internally. And the danger is, it's moving like a rocket. And it's moving away from everyone else. So whereas we were, Kevin knows the figure, so we are already in London where there are sections outside of London now where we're a whole grade, a whole year in front in many areas, but we're now heading towards 2 years being in front. And the speed of the movement is huge because it has this capacity, and it's not a structure, and it's interesting talking, if I can link it to the next presenter, but there's not a formal structure for it. It just seemed to have got into, is that fair? It's just in the way it now runs. It's this huge dynamic, or I don't know.
Kevin, can I put you on the spot? Is there a microphone there, John? You were inside the system. You were both within the department and in Tower Hamlets, transforming your own section of this incredible city. To use the language that George is using, more around knowledge generation, knowledge management, knowledge transfer, is that the way in which you thought about the shift in the system?
Yeah, so just for context, I was running one of the education systems, the borough called Tower Hamlets, which has the highest percentage of low economic kids, and yet I do need to drop this in, now the 4th highest performance of all London boroughs out of the 35 in the city. And I think what George has touched on a number of the key points. It was the head-to-head stuff that really changed. It was the way that heads took a broader responsibility, not for their pupils, but for the wider community of other children. Yeah. That really changed. That bit of commitment to others, I think, was key. We have to be honest, though. There was a London effect, as well as a London sort of structured challenge. So we've had new communities arrive in London, which have been incredibly supportive of education, dynamic and progressive for their children. Some of the new communities, when you strip out that effect, there's a huge benefit of having, someone raised earlier about the Australian communities. In England, the evidence is crystal clear. New immigration and new communities are a boost to our education attainment, not a drag. And the evidence is crystal clear on that for our country. So London's had benefit from that, but George's point is the right one. It was when the heads, people like George who led this, came forward and took on responsibility for other heads. That's what changed the thing.
And in terms of professional practice, those heads not only took responsibility for their own community, for network leadership, and therefore saw themselves as system leaders, wider system leaders, but they did it, to use the language we are talking about today, with discipline innovation.
Yes, absolutely.
So just a word about how they took on the responsibility to use evidence.
No, there was no time to waste, there was no resources or energy we had to move quickly, so there was an imperative. And I think that dynamic imperative meant that we stopped doing things which were interesting but not impactful, and we went to intent. And I think that's the bit where evidence kicked in. We actually got more savvy about doing what made a difference rather than doing stuff that was interesting and perhaps a fad or a fancy, rather than actually working straight through quickly to impact on children's outcomes.
And challenge partners today, next generation?
Yeah, well, Challenge Partners is the next step really along the journey, much more sophisticated sort of model, where the heart is really the review and the capacity of the hubs across the country then to systemically lead rather than systems lead. So systemically lead is what builds it, and then we systemically lead above that as a tier above, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what you've got is hubs of schools based around maybe a collection of historically maybe primary right through to secondary feeder, it might be just specials, a whole different range. Sometimes but basically they're for a genuine educational reason, who then get together and share and drive and innovate. But I think if you don't mind, I'd just like to just say two things to you about this. One is very important. I failed to mention it, but I would like to just say this. This is what was written by the Department of Education and Skills in 2003. When the very best of what happens now in London schools becomes the norm, when all London resources and communities are fully engaged in the task of raising standards, then our aim is realised. And that's a fantastic statement, because we've never got there. And the fact is we've never accepted that we've got there. I think this is the key. There is no end game. In this. There isn't a point at which we can all say, well, the job has been done. It's never done. If we're to stay with the competition that exists out there.
It's going to be interesting, I think, because, Michael, this afternoon I know that the question about system leadership is going to be central to your message. Rob Nairn this morning talked about the profession leading. So the distinction between our current conception, perhaps, of where leadership resides is changing dramatically.
Yeah, I think, and with that, I always say that we're looking for leaders who can subsume their own ambitions for their own organisation within those of a group. And that's quite a skill. And so how do you then get that group to achieve your own ambition?
Yep.
Because there's always governors and parents at the back are saying, hang on, what are you doing helping that school over there? You're meant to be running this one. Quite rightly so. And it's quite a hard check and balance. Why is that staff going over there? Quite rightly. And so therefore you need to have thought, and it doesn't work otherwise. Because in this world, if you think people, I can go on forever, but one of the things again with Challenge Partners, people, you come into me and say, why are you joining Challenge Partners and London Challenge? Why are you joining London Challenge? The reason I really care about the children, and I say to them, well, don't bother joining. And I say, well, that's not a sustainable reason. Give me something that's really sustainable. Will you like to get the sack if the results aren't very good? Yeah, okay, that'll do fine. No, but I'm serious about it. Again, what is the real commitment for you that really matters, rather than some collective thing? Because you must reconcile your own ambition with inside the groups. If you don't, we also get a tourists, and there are lots of collaboratives full of tourists.
Got it. George, thank you. Superb.